Welcome everyone to IISE Transactions webinar series. My name is Yu Ding. I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal and on faculty of Texas A&M University. IISE Transaction webinar series in fall 2022 features 7 talks based on the articles to be published in the special issue of the journal. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers for not only contributing to that special issue, but also making themselves available for giving a talk about their paper. That's a lot of effort, and we are deeply grateful. So our inaugural seminar features Laura Albert, professor and David Gustafson, department chair of industrial and system engineering at Wisconsin-Madison, and Sheldon Jacobson, founder professor in the Department of Computer Science, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Today, Drs. Albert and Jacobson will share their perspective on Homeland Security research opportunities. Based on the IISE transaction paper they co-authored with Alex Nikolaev, their own work on Homeland Security issues was recognized by various awards, including the 2018 Informs Impact Prize. So Laura and Sheldon, very delighted to have you both here today. And the platform is yours whenever you are ready.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. All right, so kind of moving along here. We are one paper in the special issue that's coming out, and I listed the other papers here. All of the seminar times haven't been set yet, but hopefully those of you attending will be able to see some of these other talks, and they'll also be recorded and up on YouTube later on. Our paper is available online, and the special issue hasn't been released yet. When it is released, it will be open access, but right now it's behind a paywall. I want to plug the journal. IISE Transactions. It's a fantastic journal and the flagship journal for the Institute of Industrial and Systems Engineering. If you don't know about the journal, it has 4 focused issues, which are kind of mega departments that are listed here. And then there are departments within each focused issue. And IISE Transactions publishes a range of research across industrial and systems engineering research methods and applications. I have a picture here of myself with my co-authors and also a link to our paper. And I made the QR code active here because you can't click on a link during the talk. And we'll make sure to post this as well after the talk. All right, so to get started, I will admit that our paper focuses on Homeland Security, mostly in the last 21 years or so. We do acknowledge that industrial engineering and operations research history and Homeland Security goes way back to the origins. The origin of operations research in particular is during World War II, when mathematical models were used to help the war effort. But really the mathematics goes even further back to like Newton, Euler, Gauss, and Lagrange. Some of the applications in World War II are worth mentioning because some of those themes emerge in the last 20 years. One of the applications was submarine surveillance and using search theory and resource allocation. You can't search the whole ocean at once. You have to target your resources. Also mine lane operations, which is a location analysis problem, and bomber raid tactics. A paper by Morse and Kimball outlines some of the applications. Also throughout our talk, we'll use the acronym IE/OR, which of course stands for Industrial Engineering and Operations Research. All right, handing things off to you, Sheldon.
All right, thank you very much, Laura. I want to thank everybody for joining us. You have a choice of how to spend your time, and I'm happy that you decided to join us today to listen to about Homeland Security research opportunities within the industrial engineering and operations research community. If we think of Homeland Security, in many ways, its genesis, the date where it began was September 11th. For many of us in our generation, this was a defining moment for our lives. I was eating a bowl of Cheerios that morning before I went to work, and lo and behold, I saw an airplane crash into one of the Twin Towers, as we see here. And it really did change a lot of what we do. Ultimately, our field is very well suited to be able to tackle problems within Homeland Security. So as heinous as the event was, it also created opportunities for us as a community to do great things. The next slide, please. Aviation security became the obvious target of application. And I personally had been working with the Office of Civil Aviation Security, which was part of the FAA prior to September 11th. September 11th happened, and lo and behold, it thrust our research into a completely different dimension. It was a paradigm shift for the country and how we were going to deal with aviation security, and I was very fortunate to be in a situation to be able to take advantage of this. But there are many other areas that have evolved over time, including securing critical infrastructures, emergency preparedness, and disaster management. All of them fall within the rubric of Homeland Security. And there's been a number of people, some of which are, in fact, we're going to be going to them for their thought leadership, which have done very excellent, technical work with a very targeted application. So the key point here is that IEOR has a place at the Homeland Security table, and the question is, how big a place do we want to secure? Next slide, please. Evolving targets have certainly occurred over time. When we first thought about what happened after September 11th, certainly the physical security around airports was very critical. But this has been a moving target, and as a result, the cyber assets that are so critical are now becoming important. Even within the TSA right now, cybersecurity is considered to be a very high topic and high priority area. We've all heard about malware, phishing, and ransomware, and once again, our community has made contributions in this domain to try and secure the cyber world as much as the physical world. Next slide, please. So what was the objective of our paper? We basically wanted to do three things. We wanted to bring together thoughts on the future directions for IEOR within the realm of Homeland Security. Ultimately, we wanted to inspire others to do great things and to tap into new data sources and create new opportunities. And ultimately, this would launch our field as being the leading domain for Homeland Security research and innovation over the next 2 decades. So this is what we were trying to achieve with our paper. Next slide, please. So as a quick outline, we basically described the footprint of what today's Homeland Security is. We then went to some thought leaders in the field, including Ed Kaplan, Cole Smith, and David Morton, Fred Roberts, and Vicki Beyer, who is joining us today, and give you a summary of their comments. If we find that what we presented does not accurately represent what they said, it is our mistake. If it does, it is to their credit. So do keep that in mind. And then we'll give a quick summary and discussion of the key points that synthesize all of their thoughts together, because there are some common themes that did come across from what they said. Next slide, please. So the IEOR footprint in aviation security was really one of the initial launches of our field into the Homeland Security domain. We saw the Aviation Transportation Security Act, which was passed in November 2001, which transitioned the FAA being the leading agency within the government to ultimately becoming part of the Department of Homeland Security eventually, which was created a new agency. And ultimately, this did launch a new era for aviation security screening strategies and tactics. It created great opportunities for us because you had limited resources, which you needed to use to screen people with unknown risk in many cases. And this was just a low-hanging fruit for us. And fortunately, having worked with the FAA security group before September 11th, it really gave our research group a tremendous opportunity to move forward and do things with them in the TSA. Next slide, please. The key, when we first started working with the FAA Office of Civil Aviation Security, was checked baggage screening. The perception was that someone would put an explosive on a plane through a checked bag, and as a result, the question is, how do you screen these? There was this classification of selectees and non-selectees, which actually at one time was security sensitive information, and now it is freely reported, so we don't have to worry about that. But ultimately, IEOR did help in the prioritization of how we would do the screening of the bags and allocate the resources, not only within airports, but across airports. Next slide, please. Then there was a paradigm shift. And this happened right after September 11th, although the fact is it was actually occurring before September 11th, that the idea of doing full screening to everybody was not viewed as being cost effective nor security effective. And the thought of risk-based security began to be bantered. This term was first mentioned around the time of September 11th, even though we were working on that concept before. Nobody knew quite what it was, and what we needed to do is define it mathematically using the kinds of tools, techniques, and measures that we have available in our community to really help the TSA understand what they can do. So risk-based security, you'll see that in some very early reports, but nobody really knew what it was. And our job was to define it. And fortunately, we did. And Laura and Alex were, in fact, involved in that research. Laura did it for her dissertation. We published several papers, including some of the ones that are cited over here. And it gives you a rough idea of the transition of thinking, this paradigm shift of moving away from the one-size-fits-all approach to, in fact, treating passengers differently based on their risk. We created both static and dynamic models. Initially, it was based on linear and integer programming models, but eventually we switched to dynamic models using the sequential stochastic assignment problem, control theory, queuing theory, Markov decision processes. And we published a plethora of papers on this topic so that we would set, in some sense, the foundation moving forward for risk-based security, not only within aviation security, but literally within the federal government, which is now being used throughout. Next slide, please. So risk-based security basically aligns security resources with security risks. This was the aha moment. And by moving away, like I said, from the one-size-fits-all security paradigm, we had to treat people differently. This was a bit of a political issue. The people in the TSA understood this, but in a world where fairness it has to come first, we had to show that this was being fair to everybody because it made security more secure for everybody if we treated people from a security paradigm differently. So this was a wonderful breakthrough. We had to do the proof of concept, which we did. Everybody benefited because security resources were being targeted more efficiently. Everybody would benefit with faster throughputs at airports. It was a win-win situation. And eventually it led to, of course, TSA PreCheck. Next slide, please. I'm trying to, oh, this is my slide. And then, of course, there are other transportation security applications that our community have contributed to, including how do you assign federal air marshals to flights which are invisible. And the kinds of techniques that we started to use involved game theory, decision analysis, decision trees. Port and border security became another issue. And our community literally started to blossom and grow as we saw the tremendous number of opportunities of our methodologies and our tools to improve homeland security across multiple domains. I'm going to pass it off to Laura now to have her give her comments on the network introduction footprint. Laura?
Yes, we did recognize that there are a couple of big bins of research that was done after September 11th. 4 years after September 11th, we had Hurricane Katrina, which was the most costly disaster in US history. And while not a security incident, it did highlight the challenge of large-scale catastrophic risks in connected systems. And network interdiction models and methods were adapted to mostly Homeland Security, but also natural disasters. And what Homeland Security or what network interdiction models do is they really look at system vulnerability and worst case risks instead of like average risks and reliability, which as industrial engineers, we study a lot. And a lot of the modeling in network interdiction looks at it's like a game theory application where there's typically a Stackelberg game. You have a leader and a follower. And in the Homeland Security context, there is a defender who might fortify parts of a network and then an attacker that has a recourse decision and has certain goals. There are defender, attacker, defender models where the defender might have some recovery recourse after the attacker goes. And the goal here is really to focus on the worst case failures, how to allocate resources in systems, how to protect against adaptive adversaries and intentional failures of a system, and really to provide insight into what to protect in a cost-effective way. What's kind of interesting about network interdiction is that it is a large-scale game on a network, and we can solve these. And so there's an algorithmic challenge and many breakthroughs that occurred. Most of the problems are formulated with a network flow problem, such as shortest path, max reliability, and max flow. So for example, in a shortest path, an adversary seeks to find their shortest path through the network. But first, the defender can act by lengthening certain arcs to make that path potentially as long as possible. Of course, the attacker then has some recourse and can adjust their path accordingly. Some of the algorithmic techniques draw upon linear programming and duality, and creating instead of a max-min problem or a min-max problem, you have a min-min problem when you use the duality results, and this allows us to solve larger scale problem instances. Bender's decomposition is also very effective, especially for stochastic network interdiction models. There are a number of applications that span intentional risks as well as natural disasters. Some of them include thwarting the transport of illicit nuclear materials, delaying a nuclear weapons project. Creating a nuclear weapons project takes a lot of time and expertise, and there are decisions to be made along the way, and delaying that as long as possible is in our best interest. Some applications focus on locating sensors on a network and power grid resilience, which is more of a kind of worst case failure application. They've also been used to study illicit drug smuggling, as well as cybersecurity attacks. And there's also questions here about fortifying critical infrastructure, such as supply chain facilities. So using location theory and location analysis. Right, so a really wide scope of potential applications in this area. And there's also been research done just in general about critical infrastructure protection coming from this community. So we really focused here on critical infrastructure protection outside of network interdiction. And there's a really long, rich history in industrial engineering and operations research in this area. As mentioned before, this community has introduced modeling frameworks to identify vulnerabilities in a number of interconnected systems. So some examples here are bolstering the US Strategic Petroleum Reserve, protecting the border, protecting our electric power grid. And what we really do well is that we're able to create models of these systems. And so connecting infrastructure to operations model and system level resilience is something that we can do with our mathematical models. So one example here is a attacker-defender model that can connect strategic defense decisions to an attack to actually operational tactical decisions that the operator would then have to make. Also in critical infrastructure protection bucket is game theory. So network interdiction models, of course, is an application of game theory that's fairly specific. But there are also a number of models that came out of this, our community after September 11th, focusing on how to allocate resources to protect multiple targets and also to harden targets. And some of the work, including that of Dr. Beer, focuses on resource allocation that protect against many types of threats, including terrorism threats and natural disaster threats. And over time, these models were expanded to lift a lot of the assumptions that the earlier models made to incorporate asymmetric information, secrecy, deception, and deterrence. Our community also played a role in asking some of the big foundational questions that is kind of implicit in all the research that we do. So the Department of Homeland Security adopted a risk equals threat times vulnerability times consequence approach for modeling risks. And this was, of course, the limitations of this was examined and discussed by our community. And the community also looked at the limitations of a lot of different paradigms, such as the modeling of adaptive adversaries. How should they be modeled in a mathematical sense? And also balancing risk assessment versus resilience. Sheldon, I'm going to hand it off to you as we move into the next part of our talk, where we summarize some of the thoughts by thought leaders in the field.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Laura. Yes, we certainly gave you a summary of where we've been. What we'd like to know is where we're going. And although Laura, Alex, and I had our own ideas, we didn't want to limit it just to ourselves. We wanted to bring in people who have made substantive and lasting contributions to the field. So we chose a handful of such people. And we basically went to them and said, tell us what your crystal ball is looking like. How can you look into the future and tell us what some of the key issues that you envision? So we went to Ed Kaplan, who's of course a professor at Yale, and he gave us a very long and interesting discussion just on homeland security threats in general. He talked about natural threats versus deliberate threats. And in many ways, natural threats can bring much more damage than deliberate threats because nature is very, very powerful. He talked about some of those issues. He also talked about how human beings could exacerbate and in fact create more problems, for example, with disease outbreak. We've seen that with COVID-19, certainly. He also talked about some papers based on the new type of threat to the homeland that pandemics in general present, because we didn't think about that after September 11th. It was a man-made, very deliberate manufactured threat. But in this particular case, we want to think much more broadly about what some of the threats are. And Ed certainly discussed that and pointed out some papers that were discussing these ideas as well. Next slide, please. In terms of intentional threats, the key is identifying the source of the threat. So sometimes we have to look and say, how did we find it? Some type of reverse engineering to be able to determine it. We saw, because Ed has done a lot of work in Israel, certainly when you have jihad terrorism and Al-Qaeda and other groups, it's very, very apparent. But domestic terrorism is far more difficult because it's often an extremism, a rare event, so it's very hard to identify. Then, of course, we have mass shootings and mass murders. And when the media starts to get involved, it really convolutes the entire situation. It becomes much more difficult and challenging to look at. So Ed recognized this and thinking this could be potentially an opportunity for us to think more broadly on how we can apply our expertise. Surveillance and intelligence gathering rules are also different between foreign and domestic threats, where the agencies are completely different, whether you're dealing with the CIA for foreign, while the FBI internally. And as a result of that, you have to look at, in some sense, how are you going to identify the sources if it's foreign versus international, but you're using different agencies who may have different protocols and literally rules that they can apply. And once again, he thought that the IEOR community could potentially contribute to that dialogue. Next, please, Laura. He also talked about the threats over the internet, and that comes into the issue of social network data, which has now become a much bigger issue and certainly an area where our community can contribute and has already contributed. So once again, monitoring and analyzing the large pool of data that's available and trying to make sense of it is very, very critical. Then, of course, there are attacks on institutions like financial institutions, other critical infrastructures, the water supply, the traffic networks. All of these are ripe opportunities for our community to basically look more closely and see where we can make a difference. Next slide, please. Ed also pointed out some very early work by, in fact, Larry Stone, which was involving search algorithms that was used by the Coast Guard to find people who were lost at sea. And this work continues in search theory to have a tremendous impact. So can we either find extensions or create new models that can have a lasting impact in that domain? And then the other issue is data fusion. How do we bring data together in an informative way and ultimately lead to more and greater insights? Because with so many sensors that are available and collecting disparate forms of data, ultimately we have to make sense of it. And Ed thought that this was another opportunity for us to consider. And now I will pass it off to Laura once again.
Sure. The next two that we interviewed were kind of related. Dr. Cole Smith from Syracuse University weighed in on network interdiction, as did Dr. David Morton from Northwestern University. I'll talk about Cole's feedback first. He really talked about vulnerability of a system and networks, but he noted that first, some very thoughtful ideas about what failure means. And really, one of the goals is to limit the scope of the damage that's inflicted. And what's key is really how we define failure. Failure could be equal to malicious intent or not. It could also represent failures that could be accidents that could occur with a sufficiently high probability that we should actually model that and try to mitigate those risks. He also recognized that usually we have a budget and network interdiction model, but an interdiction budget could represent probabilities that an arc could fail in a network for example. And he discussed some work that might be needed to equate some of the model assumptions to reality. So an example of equating a sentient attacker with an accidental failure, and also highlighted the opportunity to build vulnerability models to mitigate worst case attack and to really discover what the risks could be and how bad they could be. Dr. Smith also weighed in on the math programming community's contributions to network interdiction and acknowledged that a lot of the network interdiction models are clean and make a lot of assumptions. And this is because you can use duality and they're easy to treat from a mathematical optimization point of view. And this has enabled a lot of algorithmic contributions. But it's been at the expense of reality in terms of the models. And he recognized the need to consider turn playing in games. So moving beyond a typical one-shot Stackelberg game where you have a leader and a defender and just those 2 rounds, to consider more repeated turns. He noticed the difficulty in this. The defender attacker models are typically NP hard, and adding just a 3rd turn, a defender attacker defender model, are much more difficult. But this really would fill a gap in the literature. And he had a couple of ideas for getting started. One is that we kind of know how to play these games from a network interdiction point of view. And how do we kind of infuse that with what we could learn from artificial intelligence to figure out how to play the games pretty well, and also how to protect real systems. He also recognized the need for having both players playing quote unquote blind and not having that information that's passed between turns. And that could be very difficult on a number of levels. Dr. Smith also outlined a couple last opportunities in this area. He recognized that the optimizers and math programming community likes to stay in the realm of what they can solve with math programming. But others might be interested in more complicated games that maybe are messier and reflect applications of interest. However, those willing to do so usually lack the math programming expertise, and there's an opportunity for cross-disciplinary collaborations to address these messy problems. Dr. David Morton from Northwestern echoed a lot of these ideas and really highlighted the OR and IE community conceptualizing new approaches for resilience. And resilience was one of the themes of his comments. He did recognize where we're really strong, and we're really strong at modeling, especially modeling interconnected systems where you can query a system, maybe disable some components of the system and figure out where the vulnerabilities are and ask those what if questions. That's very natural to what we do. And this can inform a lot of hardening of infrastructure decisions questions. He recommended, building upon network interdiction, and there's connections to other really important applications such as robust optimization, adversarial models, and machine learning. And whoever comes up with these or adopts the advances of the others can maybe strengthen its longstanding theories. One of the challenges that he called out in his comments was cybersecurity. As we've talked about today in our talk, this is a very important application right now, and it's not easily addressed by the network interdiction models or really any models that we've created yet in the literature. But we have the tools to build high fidelity mathematical models to really understand the vulnerabilities and understand how to mitigate some of the risks. And this represents a potential breakthrough opportunity for the discipline.
Well, this passes along to myself. Fred Roberts, who's at Rutgers, has been a leader in Homeland Security. He's been the head of Homeland Security Research Centers of Excellence, and he provided, in many ways, stretch ideas and ideas in general that we need to think more broadly of what Homeland Security is and where we can take these ideas. He certainly discussed the infrastructure systems that have already been mentioned, like power grids and road networks and airports. In fact, these are kind of the natural places that fit into our methodologies. He also focused on the issue of balancing resiliency and efficiency. This has certainly come up during the discussion during COVID-19 when it comes to supply chains, making sure resiliency and efficiency are well balanced. But he thought that this was a much more enduring and sustainable research direction for the future, and it's something that we should think about. Election security is another area which some of our community is already looking at, and he was very high on believing that it's important for us to use our tools in that domain to create voting audit trails so that the systems can exist, not just looking at a particular election, but an entire system to ensure that the integrity can be ensured. In fact, our community get a place at the table and be a leader in this domain. Next slide, please. The other issue he looked at is enhancing detection capabilities. In other words, the location of sensors and how you use the information is critical. He also talked about border crossings, ports and customs as an area where we would in fact use such sensors and incorporate them. He also mentioned in passing robotics and intelligent machines, which in general our community is not very big on. We do some research on it, but it may be an opportunity that we can in fact program this into more of a systems approach. I know in computer science, I have colleagues who certainly do that, but it's an opportunity that we in the operations research industrial engineering community should certainly consider. He also looked at sensors in maybe non-traditional ways like counterfeit parts and supply chains, for example, using them to in fact find opportunities, even containment procedures for infectious diseases. It's critical that we think much more broadly out of the traditional footprint of where we typically live. And he certainly pushed that idea on us quite a bit in our discussions with him. Next slide, please. He also talked about sequential games with mixed policies, which of course others have already talked about. So as you'll note that there's quite a bit of overlap between some of the thought leaders. It's because these are ideas that many people are thinking about and they are converging in the same spot here. Also, we need a little bit more work on identifying, threat items, he believed. Combating terrorism is more than the threat items, though, and talks about the roots of it through the people. And also he talked about the human behavior component, which I thought is something that we often don't think about in the ORIE community, the human behavior, human factors issue. And there may be opportunities for more collaboration there where we bring our mathematical modeling expertise to the table with such people and find ways that we can in fact incorporate it into the human element. Because at the end of the day, with the exception of man-made or non-man-made or natural disasters, although with even natural disasters, we're seeing that with COVID-19, ultimately people are involved, and the source of the people, the behavior of the people, and how they act is critical. And if we ignore that completely and simply create a probabilistic distribution associated with it, in some sense, what we are doing is misleading our models because we can do so much more. Next slide, please. He also wanted to focus on new problems which are outside of the traditional domain of our community, stockpiling issues, flood control, evacuation centers, even how you in fact open and reopen after a disaster. These are all issues that are important, and anytime we've had a disaster, they've certainly been front and center in the media as the country and the communities deal with it. But we as a community have been slow to look at some of these in his belief, and it was important for us to think much more broadly on the domains that we needed and wanted to in fact tackle. And he was very encouraging that we consider this. Next slide. We'll pass it on to you, Laura.
Sure, thank you. And last but not least, we have comments from Dr. Vicki Beer, who's a professor emerita at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and one of my colleagues. And Vicki offered some really high-level thoughts about what types of risks the community should address and what would make a real difference. She really encouraged us to focus on the most serious and potentially catastrophic risks. And to frame this, she noted the Department of Homeland Security's history, which was really to secure the nation from the many threats that we face. But many of the threats that we face are not really catastrophic. And the Department of Homeland Security is a mission-oriented university, and where researchers can really, address a problem not really tackled adequately by the Department of Homeland Security is on these a few number of very serious and potentially catastrophic risks. And of course, then we could work synergistically with the Department of Homeland Security. Building on this, she noted that some of the very serious threats that we had and some of the incidents such as 9/11 and Hurricane Sandy, which are some of the more expensive disasters in US history, these two disasters were not catastrophic to New York City. It's still standing. So she really encouraged us to think quite big and boldly about the risk that we want to address. And she also noted that for a truly catastrophic risk, moving the needle a little bit can actually make a real difference to society. And we don't necessarily need to solve the catastrophic risks. So what are these catastrophic risks that we should focus on? In general, she noted that they leverage the power of nature, which alludes to some comments made by earlier experts. Of course, this includes natural disasters. And as concerning as terrorism risks are, it is very difficult for terrorists to unleash the power of nature. And as evidence, she noted that Hurricane Katrina is much more damaging and expensive to society than the terrorist attack of 9/11. Dr. Beer elaborated on this a little bit more, noting that we should address these natural risks. However, there's still a lot of variation in that box. Biological agents such as smallpox, for example, could start as an accident or an act of terrorism and then be unleashed by Mother Nature and become catastrophic through natural transmission. She noted a couple other types of risks, including forest fires, which are becoming increasingly catastrophic in the Western US. And of course, climate change, which could make large parts of the world unlivable. And the effects of climate change could vary from rising sea levels to inland flooding to the lack of available drinking water. And as we look downstream, that could force climate-induced migration, and that would be a big challenge, and that could in part be addressed by our community. Dr. Beer also highlighted the need for multidisciplinary approaches, and including mathematical modeling. We do this pretty well right now, but there's probably more work to do. So we have math models of epidemiological models and agent-based models of flood response. She also noted that these applications really involve humans, and working with social scientists and with those who have expertise in socio-technical systems is kind of the recipe for making a breakthrough. So we synthesized our thoughts and those of the thought leaders and came up with 5 challenges for the IEOR community. And I will hand things off to Sheldon to get us started.
All right. Thank you, Laura. It's just like there's 7 habits of highly effective people. We have our 5 key ideas that are takeaways for everyone who's working in the field. Number 1 was consider attacks that do not happen at discrete points in time. And this really challenges the traditional definition of risk based on an expectation ultimately. And we have to look at, in fact, the attack, the risk across a continuum or a life cycle. We think this is a real important opportunity for our community to think about. Certainly this brings into the fact that we have to gather data, gather information, and deterrence is so critical as opposed to simply detecting and responding. Social networks is very valuable, and this enables us to basically create the inverse problem and do forensic analysis within the Homeland Security domain. And this really comes down to the who rather than the what. Who is doing the attacking? How can we in fact intercept them long before they even get to the point of execution or even thinking of the execution? And these are opportunities that we believe exist for our community. Our thought leaders agreed with this, and we certainly do as well as the researchers. Next slide, please, Laura. Shift from the physical to the cyber targets. We've invested a tremendous amount in the physical targets, and we've done a very good job of it. It's in some sense within our wheelhouse, our domain of expertise, but moving into the cyber world, where the data is so rich, and in fact, I would say overwhelming, we now have to think a little bit more strategically in how we're going to use our methodologies and tools to be able to tackle such problems. This also comes into the fact that when dealing with data, is the data in fact legitimate? Is it valid? And misinformation becomes a real problem. The multi-layering of networks also becomes an issue. We can't simply be in a single dimension. By being in multiple dimensions of networks, the problems become much more complex, much more messy, and much more challenging. And the next one, please, Laura. Resiliency rather than optimality. This was a theme that was persistent across a number of the experts, that we always like to focus on what is best, the optimality. But ultimately, that is not going to necessarily lead to a robust or resilient solution. And we need to find, in some sense, this nexus between optimality and resiliency. Ultimately, this creates multi-criteria problems. And then how do you deal with the multi-criteria problems? Because are they weighted the same? Are they weighted differently? And in some sense, equity in large-scale disruptions becomes a real practical issue. And then with COVID-19, it's really taught us a lot of lessons. One of them, certainly the importance of resiliency. And then it's not a matter of just being resilient for a single time period. It's being resilient over multiple time periods, because it's the constantly evolving and changing threat that we have to deal with. And these are, once again, more opportunities for our community to think more broadly, develop new models and methodologies that can help address these. Laura, I'll pass it off to, no, I think I have one more. Artificial intelligence, of course, being in computer science, I should talk about that. Leveraging data. Once again, there's a plethora of data. How do we use it? Ultimately, I think the four cornerstones in terms of preventing damage at the end is deterring, detecting, mitigating, and recovering from attacks, but ultimately driving it using data. So many of the catastrophic events, as I think Vicky talked about, are rare events. And ultimately, that means that the data may not even contain information about them. How do we deal with that when, in fact, the data does not indicate a possibility that's moving forward? I think we have to think about this. So ultimately, AI is a critical way to leverage these large data sets. I think our community is doing a better job of doing this. I think there's tremendously more opportunities we can do. And ultimately, how do we achieve unbiased insights? Because one of the big criticisms of AI and modeling is the biases that are inherent. And how can we do this in a manner that removes the bias so that we can give objective insights and analysis which can meet the scrutiny of all stakeholders? Ultimately, this is a real challenging problem because we don't always have complete data. Ultimately, there is the dependence causality network nexus that we have to overcome. Statisticians deal with this, but we in the OR-IE community certainly should be doing this as well. And now I'll pass it on to Laura to finish things up.
Yes, all of our experts that we interviewed mentioned interconnected systems. It was a pervasive theme. So when we synthesized this, we noted that for a lot of engineered systems that we're looking to protect, preventing the worst outcomes is prohibitively expensive. And this is a real advantage for our math models that really focus on their connections and the implications. And again, small improvements that are targeting resources can actually maybe not prevent the whole risk, but maybe bring it down to a level that's manageable for society and is actually achievable with the limited resources that we have. There was also some themes about improvements in modeling of the connectedness of infrastructure systems and really understanding how events could cascade over time, and noting that those cascading events down the road can become even more hazardous than the original event. And finally, our experts noted that there are humans involved in infrastructure systems that we want to protect, and we really need to start modeling human behavior in a much better way. And this can involve working with our colleagues in other domains, social sciences, human factors, socio-technical systems, but also focusing on incentive policies where humans play a part in implementing the solutions. So with that, and we want to thank you for attending our talk. And we have a link to our paper if you didn't catch it earlier. And we are here to answer any questions that you might have.